One of the biggest threats to America today is intolerance of others based on what they believe, where they're from, and how they pray. Today's guest, Jonathan Greenblatt, a successful entrepreneur and former presidential advisor, is the national director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. His job is to protect and advocate for all those who are victimized and ostracized by hate. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
The hard things that are necessary, we either do it or we'll pay the price down the road.
That often is missing in politics.
We have to solve everything.
It's a nightmare.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
I have faith in the American people.
Those are the facts.
The Illuminati, right there. Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
What's in this tea?
Jonathan, just a pleasure to have you here today. We were talking off camera about your background. Tell us a little bit about how we got here.
This is certainly not a job I ever expected to be in. It's not a job that I necessarily aspire to, but it feels like an extraordinary responsibility and such a privilege. I was with a private equity firm looking to invest in a company or buy a firm, and I got a call from the Obama people. He had an Office of Social Innovation in the West Wing. He wanted someone who'd created jobs to run it because he wanted to focus on accelerating job creation. This was the kind of jobless recovery in the 2010, 2011. And look, I was not an Obama person, but I came back to Washington. I took a meeting with other people in the West Wing, including him, and he was very compelling, and I ended up getting offered the job.
It's hard to say no to the president, right?
He's a very special guy. He's incredibly smart and thoughtful. So I ended up joining his team and focusing on how could we, again, accelerate economic recovery domestically using innovation. And I ended up getting a call about the ADL opportunity. And you get a lot of interesting calls when you're in a front-facing job in the White House.
Sure.
I took the meeting not really thinking anything would come of it.
Right.
But one thing led to another, and they offered me the position, and that was over 10 years ago.
So, Jonathan, for those few people in America, I think, who don't know about the ADL, tell us about it.
Thank you for asking. The ADL is the leading anti-hate organization in the country. We have three basic sort of lines of business. We protect, we advocate, we educate. So we measure anti-Semitic attitudes. We've been doing that for decades. We track incidents. We've been doing that for almost 50 years. And we investigate every report that comes into us. Secondly, we monitor and disrupt extremists. We have a whole center on extremism that 24/7 is monitoring the public web, the private web, and the dark web, tracking, left-wing radicals, tracking political Islamists, tracking right-wing extremists, tracking white supremacists, all forms of hate, and giving thousands of tips to law enforcement. And then we train. We're the largest trainer of law enforcement in the country on extremism and hate. Last year we trained upwards of 18,000 law enforcement officers, federal, state, local. What's a hate crime? Who are the extremists?
But the information that the ADL gets every day, 24/7, must be daunting. All the stories and all the stuff out there that you have to deal with, as you said, trying to train law enforcement and be sensitive to and be aware so they can spot it, right? And then to advocate, so to your point before, getting ahead of the game as opposed to being behind.
The reality is that our staff is fielding phone calls, emails, text messages, online forums of people who've experienced hate and harassment. And look, we're a data-driven organization. We're evidence-based. So just because someone calls in and makes a claim, we validate every claim before we would, register it.
Good.
Which is important. But let me be clear, to get to 9,000 plus, real incidents, you have a lot more reports coming in, and it is daunting and it is depressing. My staff has very high utilization rates of counseling services.
Imagine.
It's ugly stuff. At the same time, ADL is there for our community. People know when something happens and they will call ADL and we will respond. So when a kid gets bullied at school, law enforcement won't help, but ADL will. Your mailbox has been vandalized, your house has been egged, or someone spray paints swastikas on your garage. I've seen all this stuff. Because they're Jews, ADL responds. So we deal with people when they're in some of their most vulnerable stages, and it's hard stuff, and it's
Aren't you like the hotline, essentially?
Yeah. ADL is like the 911
That's it.
for the Jewish community. And by the way, for other communities. So when Hispanic people in like 2017, 2018 were getting a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, they called ADL and said, can you help us? And we did. In 2020, 2021, when was that rise of anti-Asian hate, because there was a lot of claims about, Asian people and COVID, ADL literally incubated a brand new organization called the Asian American Foundation to help the Asian American community build the kind of capability we have to fight hate against them. That organization, by the way, has raised over $1 billion for the Asian American community since we launched it and spun out. Now it's independent. We created an organization in UAE, the Menara Center on Regional Coexistence, to support the Abraham Accords, to promote tolerance between Jews and Muslims and Christians in the Middle East. So we are the 911 for the Jewish community, and we're very focused on taking what we've learned, sharing best practices, and helping other communities replicate and sort of strengthen their own capacity to push back against bigotry and hate.
The reports just came out recently talking about a record number of anti-Semitic incidents of harassment and abuse last year. You have, of course, a story we all kind of lived through with Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Passover night. An arsonist trying to break through the front door of the governor's mansion. It's kind of all around us. A couple of years ago, you wrote a book, It Could Happen Here. And it is talking about the inflection point where this whole thing is leading to something more large scale in terms of violence and something maybe we can't control. How close do you think, Jonathan, are we today to that tipping point?
It's a great question. It's interesting. I mean, I wrote that book after reflecting on what happened in Pittsburgh.
The synagogue in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, the shooting in October of 2018. 11 people were gunned down on a Saturday morning. It was the single sort of bloodiest anti-Semitic event in American history. And 6 months to the day, we then had another shooting, this one in Poway, California, a suburb of San Diego, another synagogue. And then a couple months later, we had a rash of violence in Brooklyn. We had a shooting at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City. We had a stabbing at a rabbi's house in Muncie, New York, where he was killed. And so processing all of these incidents led me to start writing. And look, I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor from Germany. When he was a young man, he never thought anything would go wrong, and we know what happened. And I'm the husband of an Iranian Jewish woman who came to the United States as a political refugee in the late 1980s. Before Khomeini, they never thought anything would go wrong.
And she's a human rights activist.
She's a human rights activist.
Yeah.
And so those experiences led me to think, what's going on here in America? And even though I could think it could never go wrong, maybe it could happen here. If you see what's happening on these college campuses, where Jewish kids are getting attacked, not because of their views on Israel, even though, by the way, that would be highly objectionable and not okay, but just because they're Jewish, being barred from walking across the campus, being physically assaulted, or I think about some of the stuff that's happened off our campuses. The director of the Brooklyn Museum, like having red triangles and calling her a white supremacist. And then I think about, one of the regents at the University of Michigan, these awful people threw jars of urine through his window at night, left rat poison at his door. I mean, this is not normal. So in some ways it feels like it is happening here, the normalization of anti-Semitism, the legitimization of anti-Zionism, and the sense that all Jews are targets, not because of, again, what they might even believe, but just because of who they are, not for anything they've done, just because of how they pray. Like, that's astonishing. So we've got real work to do to push back on this trend once and for all.
So what's underneath all this? And more importantly, and your book addressed this too, what can we do about it?
Well, look, I mean, for starters, distrust creates space for scapegoating. Extremists feel emboldened, and social media is shaping the discourse. So how do we deal with it? Leaders need to lead and call out the extremists consistently and clearly, irrespective of their politics or their partisanship. We need whole of society approaches so everyone finds ways to step up and shut this down. Like, we can't wait for someone to come save us. Education needs to change. Business has a role to play. Government has a role to play. The media has a role to play. And then thirdly, again, I think we need to rein in social media. I know this might be an unpopular view, but I think we need to be intentional and to make sure that the tech companies, who are the most profitable businesses in the world, with the most sophisticated tech in the world, abide by the same standards that mainstream media abides by.
Well, there's been so much coverage of acts of anti-Semitism on college campuses. Let's go there. Yeah. And a lot of men and women in leadership, presidents of universities, had a very difficult time balancing these two ideas of freedom of speech and the need to protect the interests of everyone on campus, right? Everybody, right? And the first approach seemingly was to straddle, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to piss off anybody, I'll say something here and then we'll say something over here and hopefully this goes away. It didn't go away, it grew. And by the lack of really standing up and leading in those moments, unintentional as it may have been, those leaders on college campuses actually enhanced the problem.
I totally agree. Look, college presidents are not necessarily profiles in courage, right? They're chosen or selected for those roles in large part because they're academics who are good at administrating and they find themselves in these positions. And so what they're used to is sort of fundraising and not necessarily hand-to-hand combat with hardened activists. And let's be clear, Hamas supporting organizations have exploited their weakness. There are absolutely networks on these campuses of groups. I mean, we track them at ADL, we monitor extremists, and we've seen them in a deliberate and intentional way run these systematic campaigns that not just marginalize the Jewish kids on campus, but delegitimize the whole idea of being a Zionist and try to shrink the spaces where Jewish people not feel safe, but are safe. And these college presidents, again, with a confused idea of what freedom of speech is, or with a warped sense of what freedom of assembly is, have allowed this to happen. Freedom of assembly is not the freedom to assemble in front of like the Hillel on campus and scream at the Jewish kids walking into services on a Saturday. And freedom of speech is not the freedom to shout down speakers with your heckler's veto and not allow them to have their views heard. And freedom of expression is not the freedom to intimidate and terrorize your classmates.
Well, colleges are supposed to be a place you go for the wide expression of diversity of opinion. That's what it should be. But it should not be a place where someone's opinion, if it is not the popular opinion of the day, is used as a battering ram to demonize parts of the population. And this is why preaching to the choir, when you think about a college president who has many publics, right? You have the faculty, which is, a big concern here, right? You've got the students, you have the parents, you've got the donors, right? So the reason I can see intellectually why they tried to do this marionettes kind of straddle, but they made it worse. Yeah. Because sometimes, Jonathan, you got to call it for what it is.
Look, you're from Florida, and we can talk about leaders in places like University of Florida, Gainesville. President Ben Sasse was amazing. And Julio Frank at University of Miami, amazing. Now, Ben Sasse, a former elected official, Julio Frank was an economist from Mexico, but both of them had a kind of moral clarity. And look, the truth is, again, there are these Hamas-supporting organizations which have a deliberate agenda. And again, we know this because we track them at ADL. On October the 8th, the day after the massacre on the 7th, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. These groups, like Students for Justice in Palestine, were pushing out material about how to talk about the, quote, genocide in Gaza. This was
immediately.
Right. And describing the state of Israel as the, quote, Zionist entity. Look, this is nuts. This is certainly not normal, and we shouldn't normalize it. And so when these college presidents dithered and equivocated and couldn't seem to muster, again, the means to just call out what happened and to stand with their Israeli and Jewish students, who is in there whispering in their ear to tell them this is okay? Why are they hesitating in the face of a clear and lucid example of evil? It's hard to totally understand.
How has the current situation in Gaza made your job much more difficult? I mean, obviously, people are still dying. There's still, incredibly retching human interest stories that are coming out of that part of the world. There's an attempt to try to bring everyone to the table, so to speak, but it's not so easy.
Yeah.
Is that something you have to kind of deal with every day? And you're looking forward to the day, perhaps, Jonathan, when that's brought in, hopefully for a landing and we can start to breathe again?
Yeah. I mean, look, I am looking forward to the day when the hostages are released. There's still 58 hostages held in Gaza, held captive in cages. I'm looking for the day when Hamas is removed from power and the Strip is demilitarized so the Palestinian people can grow and thrive and prosper. But that's going to take a leadership change in Gaza and an entire rehabilitation of their education system. Like they denazified Germany after the Second World War, we need to de-Hamasify Gaza when this war is over. That being said, if you see these pictures of suffering children, you hear these stories of bereaved families, and you don't grieve or your heart doesn't break, maybe you don't have a heart. Like, I think it is certainly, absolutely, not just positively plausible, it is appropriate to hold two things to be true at the same time. Hamas is an evil organization that must be destroyed, with a genocidal ideology that must be not just countered but defeated. And yet people, moms and dads, sons and daughters, Palestinian or otherwise, like they need to be respected and preserved. So let's hope that that conflict can be brought to bear, that a situation is resolved with as little suffering as possible for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, for everyone. Now, that being said, we still find people who are holding Jewish people here collectively responsible for what Israel is doing, or somehow suggesting there is an equivalence between the campaign in Gaza and the evil of Hamas.
Right.
So that makes my job hard, and my role here at ADL is to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, and that's why I'll keep addressing it on campuses and workplaces, online, wherever it appears.
You once said, I don't care how you vote, I care about what you value.
Yeah.
Now, it's much more difficult than ever today, as you know, Jonathan, to say anything that isn't run through a political prism where people try to put you in a corner, one corner or another. How difficult does that make it for you with the ADL, which is a nonpartisan organization devoted to eliminating hate?
In many ways, in this moment, when again there is this indisputable sort of tsunami of anti-Semitism, this is the hardest thing, which is to say, that Tip O'Neill expression, all politics are local. Mm-hmm. Now it feels like all politics are national, and everything gets reduced to a binary.
Yeah.
Are you on the blue team or the red team? Our job at ADL, to use an analogy, we're the umpire calling balls and strikes. And so we don't play for the blue team or the red team. Doesn't matter if you're standing at the plate. Doesn't matter if your jersey is blue or red. It's the same strike zone. And we're going to call it like we see it. And yet today, when everything is in this reductive way, everything is framed as political, it's incredibly difficult.
So when the President Trump, does something that you think is powerfully important for eliminating anti-Semitism and hate, and you say anything that supports that, there's going to be incoming, right?
100%.
From the other side, 100%. So to speak, right? And if we can't make that work, how can we succeed in giving the younger generations the confidence and belief that we can get through this?
I may or may not agree with everything President Trump is doing, but I should have the kind of intellectual honesty to call things as they are, not as I want them to be. So it is certainly true, as we were talking about a minute ago, there is an undeniable calamity on these college campuses. President Trump has leaned in to take action to hold the schools accountable. And if you look at the letter that he sent to Columbia University, it was very powerful. And they immediately agreed to a number of the stipulations that the administration sent, how they would suddenly deal with anti-Semitism. And by the way, ADL's dealt with this for years. You've probably seen our campus report card.
Yeah, sure.
We've graded these institutions, and that grading has worked to move them to do some things. The public shaming has pushed them, but cutting funding pushed them way
It's another
way
kind
harder.
of shame, right?
Yeah, it's another shame.
Right.
Now, all that being said, I think there are challenges if we overreach with addressing the issues on campus. Like, I don't want to disable our system of higher education. I don't want to cut life-saving research. I mean, this is a jewel of American innovation and a source of competitive advantage for us on the global stage. But the idea that the president holding these schools accountable is somehow inherently an abrogation of his role, I totally disagree with. But, when I praise President Trump or I praise the administration for getting it right, I am slaughtered by folks on the left who just have a kind of, Trump derangement syndrome. And then admittedly, when I say things, I would do some things differently and I might challenge things the administration is doing, then I get attacked by people on the right who say I'm like an Obama operative. Right. So I think you can't win. So knowing that, knowing it going in, thickens your skin. Right. It hardens your resolve, and it allows me to be incredibly principled and not political. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not looking for some appointment. I'm not seeking votes. I'm just going to call it like I see it with fidelity to ADL's mission. And that's, I think, allowed me to get through this.
Intuitively, you would think to change things, dramatically change things the way they are on this front, you got to go young. I don't want to say you write off older people, right? But, they tend to have harder baked-in opinions about all sorts of things, right? But if you don't reach the young, Jonathan, if you don't change the trajectory of the way things are moving on these fronts, they'll become what the rest of society is, which is, not tolerant enough, not sensitive enough that, this is a basic human right that if we deny is something that really washes back on all of us.
Such a good question and such a smart observation about the difference between young and old in this regard. As I was saying before, ADL is a very data-driven organization, and we do these surveys of anti-Semitic attitudes every couple of years. We work with the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. It's overseen by our team of PhDs in our research group. I mean, it's really bulletproof. In our most recent survey, and I should say in the last 5 years, intense or elevated anti-Semitic attitudes have more than doubled in the United States, from 11% of the population to 24%. But what's most notable is that for the first time, we see that young people, millennials and Gen Z, have a higher likelihood to have intense anti-Semitic attitudes than older people.
Wow.
Which you've never seen before.
Right.
To your point, we have got to engage the next generation. So at ADL, one of the things that we're doing is we try very hard not just to deal with the downstream, implications, like someone's home is vandalized, we help them, but how do we go upstream and interrupt anti-Semitism before it happens? So we are moving pretty aggressively into education reform, and we need to modify and innovate our approaches. I mean, it's clear that doing the same old thing is not going to generate different results. And so in order to address the font of anti-Semitism on these campuses, I think it requires things like tenure reform to address the issues in the faculty line, so to speak, governance changes to address the issues on the boards, viewpoint diversity to make sure that everyone's views are accepted. There's a cancel culture on campus towards conservatives. I mean, all the data shows us that, again, if you don't hew to a very particular dogmatic left-wing ideology, you don't get heard. But I'll also say we need to look at the dark money at these campuses. Like, I call it dark philanthropy. Is it foreign money who's investing in these schools, who is pushing the campuses and radicalizing them in ways that might not be obvious to the ordinary alumni? So there's a lot of work to be done. And in the same way that ADL 70 years ago moved into civil rights reform because we felt that was the way to address the problem, now we need to move into education reform and address it on the college campuses and, by the way, in K-12 schools. So we just released a new report looking at the issue of anti-Semitism in independent K-12 schools. The problems are legion. We've seen a massive, like almost a 350% increase in incidents in these schools since 2020. Problems where a vast majority, not just of Jewish kids, but non-Jewish kids are observing incidents, acts of harassment and vandalism and even violence. I mean, at the end of the day, all we want is for Jewish kids and the Jewish kind of minority be treated the same way other kids in the minorities are treated. Equal treatment. That's all, and that's what we're going to push for.
You have a very tough job because you have to ask the difficult questions that lead to discomfort with a lot of people to get to the promised land of salvation. But there is a flicker of hope here that we can actually go after this. As much as the numbers are going the wrong way, we know what to do to turn them. And part of this, I think, Jonathan, right, is to take it from the back pages onto the front pages. Many of these things you talk about and deal with are not headlines, but they happen every day. There are headlines for the individuals involved, but maybe not for the rest of the world. And I think the more you can shine a light on this, the freer I think all of us will feel. And the more we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, you know what, in this country, regardless of where you come from, regardless of your faith, you count.
Yeah, like I totally agree with that. I mean, as bad as it is, let me be clear, like I'm long on America. There has been no country in the history of humanity that has been more important to the development of our people than America. So I am betting on this place. I want it to be the best that it can. That's why I'm so committed to the work. Because again, my grandfather lost everything in Germany when it turned, and my wife lost everything in Iran when it turned. I'm not going to let that happen here. Like, I don't care how people vote. I care what they value. And ultimately, when I talk to Americans all over the country, I don't ask them like what their political affiliation is.
Don't go there.
But they share a set of basic values like decency and neighborliness and kindness. And I think those are very American attributes. And we need to push back on the negativity coming out of social media and push back on the craziness coming out of our politics and lift up the common sense values again.
Well, Jonathan Greenblatt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.